Welcome to the ARL Now podcast. I'm host Dan Agito, and today we're talking to our guest, Roman Haferd, Executive Director of Restorative Arlington. Before we get started, let's first tell you about our sponsor for this episode. Here at ARL Now, we've worked out of industrious co-working spaces for years, and honestly, it's been a great experience. Everything's taken care of, the coffee's brewed, the supplies are stocked, and you can just focus on your work. If you're looking for a productive workspace, Industrious has metro-accessible locations right here in Arlington. Check them out at industriousoffice.com. Roman, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dan. I've enjoyed ARL Now, and it's really great that you reached out. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, on this podcast, we do sort of features on different organizations, different people around Arlington who are doing important work that people may not have heard about. And I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit about what work you guys do at Restorative Arlington.
Sure. So Restorative Arlington is a community-based, place-based, obviously, in Arlington, provider of restorative justice services. And people might ask, what does that mean? The nice thing is there's specific examples of how restorative justice is offered to people in the community, people in need, particularly people who've been victimized either by a crime or by other harm, domestic violence, and things like that. So at its root, restorative justice is an offering and an option for people who have experienced harm or experiencing conflict, such as, being victimized by a crime. And what the restorative justice movement provides is an option where you can choose, sometimes we call it diversion, like diverting the harm from the traditional path of the justice system, which is just, arrest and then some sort of adjudication process. And oftentimes a victim of harm won't really have much understanding of that process and feels kind of disconnected. So over the years, the restorative justice movement has been growing because people have been asking for a different way for them to be more at the center of what happened to them. And so what Restorative Arlington does in Arlington is we have strong partnerships with the Office of the Commonwealth Attorneys for Arlington and different other partners in the city who work with people who've been victims of crime that will refer us to them. And so then we approach those folks and say, hey, look, if you're interested, we have facilitators who are trained and ready to work with you so that you can kind of guide the pathway of what justice looks and feels like for you. And there's kind of a therapeutic element to it. It's kind of a facilitation element. Some people think of it as mediation or social work, but it really is this big, nationwide movement that's been growing over the past couple decades to provide this. And I really love it because often at the end of the process, if the people are consenting, we bring the person who's caused harm and the harmed party together with their family members or their chosen supporters. And they have that accountability conversation with facilitation, of course, and with a lot of preparation so that it's a safe conversation. And they decide what the outcome is going to be, what the agreement is going to be. And that's a really, really satisfying process. I'm a lawyer myself. I've practiced in criminal courts for years. I have my own civil rights practice. So I've seen how the adversarial process works. And sometimes that's really important, but there's rarely a really total feel-good moment for everybody involved, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the person who's harmed, and certainly the defendant or the person who's caused harm. The reason why I've been doing restorative justice now, hundreds of cases for a decade, and why I'm so excited that it's really blossoming in Arlington with Restorative Arlington is because so often we get that feel-good outcome for everybody involved, where every accountability has been taken. There's a consensus agreement. For example, I had a case recently with a fight at a bar, right? And it was even kind of racially charged. And these are kind of like the most intense, some of the deepest issues facing our society and our community that so often ends in just like, if it's, it just ends in kind of negativity. But with the restorative justice process allowed those folks to understand each other, to talk directly with each other, and to work out what would make this feel better for me. Not just seeing this person who was suffering from addiction issues and other neurodivergence issues, and all that came out. And so this person was able to be humanized, not just as a racist person, but someone who was struggling and who hadn't found the right support to address those struggles. And it was really difficult for him and his father to show up to that conversation and make it through, a 3-hour conversation where he's being asked to stay sober and to not carry items on him or wear certain things that are going to cause him to take on this more aggressive identity. And some of these really core things to his identity he was asked to let go of to show that he really intended to change. And it's beautiful to be a part of those transformational conversations and to see these victims on the other side really be impressed and have their skepticism, not just of this person, but of the restorative justice process, to have their skepticism changed to the point where I teach law students about restorative justice, and one of the participants of that conversation where there was the bar fight, he's appeared multiple times to classes I'm teaching or trainings that I'm doing to talk about his experience and how impressed he was and surprised he was that he came away from the process feeling like it worked. So that's just one example of how restorative justice works in a criminal context. And then Restorative Arlington, we are also developing other avenues for people to both get training in restorative justice so they can use it in their communities, in their workplaces, in their families, just use the process of dialogue in that way. You can kind of think of it as kind of nonviolent communication or like solutions-based dialogue, circle keeping. So we have a circle keeping training that more and more community members can take. I think we're offering now 4 of those per year, and it's a multi-day training. And at the end of that, you really have the tools along with a community of practitioners to support conflict wherever it shows up, in a school, in your workplace, between your partner or wherever. You actually can step forward and engage that and facilitate it in a way that uses these tools for a productive process. So that's circle keeping. So I'll pause there. I'm just kind of giving you a sense of some of the things that we do, and you can let me know if that's making sense or.
Sure, yeah. I know it's a pretty involved process. And if I'm remembering correctly from previous conversations I've had, I mean, this isn't quick. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what the process looks like from start to finish?
I will answer that, and I also appreciate you giving me space to answer questions in slightly roundabout ways, because when you say it's not quick, where my head goes is, anything that involves changing our habits, which restorative justice is about changing our habits. Everything about restorative justice, even learning that terminology. And for example, Dan, had you heard the term restorative justice before this call?
Well, from a couple of previous stories I wrote about this, yes.
Okay. Well, so you heard about it. When I was in law school 15 years ago, I'd never heard of it. I didn't even hear about restorative justice, even though I was practicing as a student attorney in criminal law. And now I don't know that I would say it's a household name, but it has seeped into how we think about approaching conflict in society. And that's exciting, but that's a slow process. So when you ask me to talk about how it's not a quick process, I'm actually proud of that, because there's all sorts of trends that come up in society, and the quicker they are to be adopted, the quicker they are to leave. Restorative justice is a slow process because it's a deep process. Sometimes some of my teachers say restorative justice moves like water or moves like a river. It's kind of slow and consistent. And that's what you want for it to be safe to try something new, to change our habits. So even Restorative Arlington now, we're going to celebrate our 5th anniversary. And even before that, I worked with Kimiko Leidy and other early founders, Leanne Roselle, in developing Restorative Arlington based on other programs, including the program I helped start in DC. So this is a years-long, slow, deliberate, careful process. And that's because ultimately restorative justice is meeting people at some of their most vulnerable moments, at some of the most important moments of their life, whether we're talking about young people who are potentially facing a criminal process. That's a big deal. And people being harmed, sometimes seriously, and being finding themselves and their family members as victims of crime. Like these are important moments to hold, and we don't take that lightly. And so the process of building trust with community to try that on takes time. And then to answer your question more directly, the process itself for any given person, it can be quick, but usually it takes time just because it's deeply consent based. So informed consent is the touchstone of restorative justice, is all about agency and consent of people, versus when you think about the traditional criminal justice process, which also takes a long time, by the way. But some aspects of it can seem quicker because you have less agency. The lawyers just do their thing. They set the court date. There's procedural paperwork, and that's just it. And you're kind of along for the ride. Anytime you're given power, or we're giving power to participants, power to the people involved, that takes time to empower people. And that's an example of changing habits that at first can seem like maybe inconvenient, especially when we're trying to design our processes. But then when you try it, you're like, oh my God, this feels great. I want more of this. I like having this knowledge and power and this control over myself. So does that help?
Yeah, you mention that element of consent. Is restorative justice something that a judge can order, or is it something that people have to seek out for themselves?
It's in some case, so I certainly have heard of programs where I would say the short answer is no, it's not. I'm hesitant to say that because every program around the country is a little different. And there may be programs where a judge could order like diversion and restorative justice is an option. But generally speaking, no, it's something that is worked out between the victim, and then the prosecutors will propose it, and then maybe the judge can accept it, but it's certainly not imposed by the court. That would be a fundamental kind of violation of the spirit of restorative justice.
What are some of the reasons why people seek it out?
Yeah, good. What's been cool to see over the last 10 years is more and more people who have heard about restorative justice, or just understand that our perhaps more traditional ways of resolving harm is limited in what it can offer, or they don't want to see somebody just punished. So there's a conversation that happens with the people who have been harmed or victimized. And in that conversation, a victim might say something like, can I just talk to the person? Or I wish I could talk to their parents, or I wish I knew why this happened to me. So we work with the prosecutor's office to help identify that when a victim is asking those sorts of questions, because restorative justice is an option for them, we want to share that and inform them about it at that point. And then that helps us in the prosecutor's office sort of determine that, oh, okay, this case would be a good candidate for restorative justice.
One of the questions I always have on my mind when we talk about restorative justice, that I think a lot of people wonder is, does this actually change people? Change harm doers in a way that criminal justice doesn't. What are your thoughts on that?
I certainly have seen that it does. Believe deeply that, there's a lot of the raw data. I've been involved in a number of research efforts and data collection efforts and randomized control studies with different programs. Really evaluate on a pure data level, like, is this doing a good job meeting our goals that we have for intervention with crime? Is it causing a changed behavior? And the evidence suggests that it is. Across the board, typically you'll see double digit in terms of percentage decreases in what we call recidivism, meaning the rate at which a defendant who's undergone restorative justice versus a similar defendant who just gets processed normally. The defendants who choose and complete restorative justice are much less likely to be rearrested or to reoffend or be reconvicted after that. And so that's a core kind of societal goal. Like, is this working? So yes. And it's actually because of that research that is often where we get the buy-in to try it out and offer more restorative justice. So yes, it is. But then there's also just the personal experience and going through the process and seeing so many of these cases. The word I like to use is it's an initiation. A lot of times, especially for younger folks, whether we're talking school age, and these are really the folks closest to my heart, I would say. It's who I started off facilitating, mostly juveniles and young adults, meaning on the defendant side. And a lot of times when there's a repeat offenses by these young folks, there's all sorts of factors. There's societal and structural factors and mental health factors and all those things. But there's one X factor, which is I like to refer to as initiation. There's this big thing happening to them. They've committed an offense that's a big enough deal to land them in our facilitating, right? Just psychologically as humans, especially as young people, that deserves an initiation process of accountability. If you think about when you were a little kid or a younger person, Dan, like, did you ever have that moment where you broke the neighbor's window or teepeed your friend or whatever it is, or even small things? And the healthy community response is to like take interest, slow down, and really force or bring attention to that and say, you have to take this, you are accountable for this, not your parents, not the system. What are you going to do about this? Are you going to do this again? And we all kind of know that feeling. And that's an initiation. That's a particular psychological process that we need to integrate and undergo in order to, again, change our habits. And just, I've become a real student of that process. And I think that process, if we all took that sensibility to our approach of conflict and of criminal justice system and everything, it would help with that part of these forces that we can control. Some of these things are bigger than restorative justice. The reason why there's still violent crime happening in our communities, that's a big issue, but there's a part of it that we can control. And I think bringing this restorative approach, this initiation mentality to it is medicine, is very healing, and is the optimal of where we want to be.
I'm curious, based on your experiences working with all these restorative justice cases, what does it take for a person to actually change their behavior, like change who they are to the point where they're not perpetuating this harm anymore?
I would say that everybody's different and every situation's different. And one of the nice things about the process is that the process of restorative justice is designed to do a better job at getting at, for each person, what is the root cause? And sometimes what they need is they need to have a good cry with the parent that they're estranged from, or the child that they're estranged from, which seems is not directly related to the crime, but that's actually what's going on for this person. So the restorative justice process does a better job by having a lot of prep conversations with both the victim and the person who caused the harm and their supporters, of getting at like, what would need to change in your life for this not to happen again.
Mm.
And that requires a certain intimacy that, again, the traditional process, even with a defense lawyer, your defense lawyer, that's not their job, right? That's not the prosecutor's job. That's a restorative justice facilitator's job. So, and that role is really important to get at the root cause as best as possible. Again, is it perfect? No, but it does a better job at something that is so important to try to address.
We've been mostly talking about restorative justice in some connection to the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
I recall writing a story a couple years back where I spoke with you guys about a program that wouldn't actually be involved with the criminal justice system at all, but that would instead be partnering with doorways for survivors of domestic violence. How has that program been going?
Yeah, no, didn't want to overwhelm by all the restorative justice. There's so many applications, there's restorative justice in the school setting and, like I said, in community with circle keeping. And there's also things like this Pathways program, which is a relatively new program. And I appreciate the invitation to explain it. And it's good to not just think about restorative justice as a criminal justice diversion program. That's a very narrow application, but an important one. We, like I said, as Restorative Arlington has, settled into the community and become more established, built trust with our partners and community members and other community leaders, like Doorways, which is a just fantastic model nonprofit from everything that I've seen after getting to know them, and has been around for decades. There's been an effort, including even by the federal government, in the Office of Violence Against Women, to, again, provide what the research and what talking to domestic violence victims and survivors, to provide the things that they need based on the real experiences on the ground, right? And one of our main conversations with Doorways, who's our partner in this program, is survivors that they provide all sorts of services for. So many of them this is not the first time that they've been exposed to abuse or violence. And again, all their experiences are so various. Every case is different. And having a restorative approach to what they're experiencing in their lives is often, we think, and we don't know because we haven't gathered research, we haven't done a ton of cases yet, but it fits in terms of the type of situation where a restorative approach to their situation is going to be beneficial for some of these survivors. And that as more and more restorative justice programs and practitioners, including some of my mentors around the country, have tested out carefully, slowly over years, offering restorative justice in domestic violence situations, there's been enough sort of good outcomes from that now we've been chosen along with a few other sites nationwide to pilot restorative justice services, meaning offering a facilitation of the situation by talking to a survivor and then talking to their abuser or the person who's harmed them. And if there's consent and if the proper, safety protocol calls are in place, which is something we talk with Doorways about, is what that means. What sort of assurances do we need to have in place to have enough assurance that this is a safe situation to offer restorative justice? If all those things are in place, we're going to start slowly taking some cases, not from police or from the criminal justice system, but from community, because we know, again, from the research, a lot of times domestic violence survivors aren't going to the police, right? They're utilizing other pathways, hence the name, if any, to address what they're going through. And so we try to meet people where they are. So we would call this a community-based referral process. And again, it's partners like Doorways that are helping us identify where would it make sense to meet people and offer these services just out in the community. And so it's very exciting in that way, and it's new. And what's going well is that sort of mutual experience, shared experience with Doorways, and starting to design how this might work. And Restorative Arlington has started to take a few cases. And so far, we're excited to continue developing that and take more referrals. Yeah.
Can you provide any more examples of cases that have benefited from restorative justice? I mean, what are some instances of victims who would come to Restorative Arlington looking to go through this process?
Pretty much anything where there's an identifiable victim or even any sort of conflict that's sort of rises to the level where the people involved desire to resolve it, I've seen restorative justice work out. In the criminal context, again, anything from school fights or like a persistent sort of conflict in school, which can be really devastating, when you start talking about kids changing schools, altering their whole life in this formative time, like that's a really good place for restorative justice. Other assaults, or, like I talked about, like the bar fight, even all the way up to, Kimiko Leidy and I facilitated a case recently, actually in Prince Williams County, that involved attempted homicide, right? Was one of the charges. And why was that appropriate? Well, because the victim, the person who harmed him, was his best friend, right? And so the traditional prosecution kind of locked him away, and he's been locked up for 3 years. And then the victim is like, who miraculously survived, is saying, here I am moving on with my life. I've gotten engaged. I'm going to have a baby. And there's this person who was so important to me that is rotting in jail, and I haven't even had a conversation with them. That's what I want. I want this closure. I want this person to know that I'm moving on, and I want to talk about what happened between us. I want to grieve our friendship that has been altered by this totally unexpected, horrible incident. And so it's those emotions, that desire, which we can all, I think, identify with from that victim, that allowed the prosecutors to say, okay, what can we do here? We don't have the tools to do this, but there's this thing called restorative justice. So those are examples, right, where it really helps to show that sometimes that type of encounter is really what's going to best serve the people involved. And of course, there was a ton of guilt and desire for reckoning on the part of the person who caused this as well. So yeah, really anything. I mean, I've seen restorative justice work really in any type of case, if you will, where there's an identifiable person who's been harmed, and where the person who's caused the harm is genuinely willing to take accountability.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about what kind of scale we're talking about when we talk about restorative justice in Arlington. I mean, well, one, just how many cases have you guys handled? But also, like, I mean, when we think about this, I can imagine an instance. I can certainly understand why, if it's your best friend that harms you, you may want that kind of a process. But do you think that restorative justice is always going to be limited to these sort of cases on the fringe, or do you have a broader ambition for it in Arlington?
Think you're going to get me in trouble, Dan, because you're going to expose my dreamer side. Restorative justice is an example of a development that is incremental in nature, which is both a good thing, but also can be frustrating for peers of mine who are serious criminal justice reformers or abolitionists who watch films like The Alabama Solution or 13, even community members who, like in Arlington, like many in Arlington, the reason we are been so well received in this community is because this is a community that wants to be proud of its programs and institutions. That's why I've liked getting to know Arlington a little bit better. Again, I'm from, I've been in DC, the DC area for like 13 years, and I've done some work in Arlington before, but this is more. And restorative justice has a lot of promise in places where people want to be proud of their institutions. And there's been a growing trend in the United States, I think rightly so, in places like Arlington where people they don't feel personally proud of, that kind of like underbelly, if you will, of like crime and punishment, right? And the jails that keep getting built and are bigger, and the sense of hopelessness with mental illness in a certain segment of the population that's being criminalized. Like, these things just are depressing. Restorative justice is incremental in that, like, it starts small and it's still a relatively small percentage of cases in Arlington. First of all, I think there's a lot of potential for restorative justice to become a standard part of an automatic response. It certainly is in my life. I'm a community leader in all sorts of places, in many communities now and groups, organizations, the idea of just immediately going to HR or immediately going to the police or immediately punishing people for a conflict or something bad happening is now becoming unthinkable, or in schools, right? So I think that shows that restorative justice has the promise to become the default response, that approach to how we think about harm. And so in that sense, I think it has a great potential to grow. And even in terms of raw numbers, like the dreamer in me says, like, look, how many decades and how much money have we put into the criminal justice system as we know it? Centuries and gazillions of dollars and budgets and careers. Whereas now I teach law students, and more law students who want to be in the criminal justice system are demanding, they want to be trained in restorative justice. They want to understand that. They want to take a new generation approach to what it means to be a lawyer working with these issues. And so, yeah, I do think things are always going to keep changing. And in my lifetime, in this chosen career, restorative justice to me is the best example of a deep seated enough culture change that it has a long arc and a long horizon. And so that incremental change moves slowly. We have, a dozen facilitators that are each doing 2 or 3 cases at a time for a couple months each case, 2 or 3 months each case. That's how many cases is that a year? It's not a huge number, but when you start to think about, okay, now more often than not, when an assault comes into the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, they're discussing whether restorative justice would be appropriate for that. And they're having that conversation with every victim. That starts to change things, and this is only just a few years in. So it just depends on your perspective of what's the long term. If you really have a long-term perspective of where we already are and where we're going, I think the change has been dramatic.
Yeah, I know it really has only been a couple of years since Restorative Arlington started, and since it became sort of a household name, household term in some respects. What do you see as next, more immediate future for Restorative Arlington?
Well, I think Arlington has all the right ingredients in terms of a solid program. The legwork has been done both from the institutional side, from the county's perspective and the Commonwealth Attorney's perspective, but also on the side of Restorative Arlington. And there's buy-in, which is huge, and there's champions for the work, and there's more and more people who are being trained in circle keeping or who have experienced restorative justice in the criminal process who are giving good feedback. So all those things are create momentum. And for me personally, as executive director, I just want to see our prosecutors feel just a ton of empowerment to refer more cases, and that's beginning to happen. And I get excited seeing the prosecutors at the OCA start to take ownership of restorative justice and hold up the successes of the program as their own. That's a big deal. So yeah, I'm just excited about more of our community leaders, whether that's professors at George Mason or the local prosecutors and schools leaders, the sheriff. While I'm here, I want to give away more and more of the success stories for them to be able to hold and take ownership of those success stories, because that to me, more than anything else, really starts to entrench this mindset. And then with that, I think that always I think the goal that we should all have is that if this is working, let's really see this become something that we expect and that is protected in terms of services that people can expect to have this opportunity. If I'm ever, heaven forbid, the victim of a crime, I can expect and ask for restorative justice. I think it's exciting to be in a community that is on the leading edge in that way. And Arlington is a community like that. We have this community is an engaged and sort of active enough community and forward thinking enough to be able to really get there. And I, as an entrepreneur and as an innovator, that's really exciting for me. So that's what's next.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to continuing to cover it, continuing to keep in touch with your team. And thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Well, you're a great host, Dan. It's been nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on.
That's all for this episode of the ARL Now podcast. Thank you to Roman for joining us today, and thank you to our community for listening. Be sure to rate and review the pod and send us any feedback at news@ARLnow.com. I'm Dan, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.